There is a test happening in almost every difficult relationship you have, and you have probably never called it by that name. It is small. It is quiet. It rarely looks like a test at all. In the moment it looks like a joke that goes slightly too far, a favor that slowly turns into an expectation, a just this once that becomes the new normal without anyone ever announcing that it had. But underneath all of it, someone is checking something. They are checking exactly how far this can go before you stop it. And every single time the answer is nowhere, they file that information away and push a little further next time. This is what toxic behavior actually runs on. Not some deep, calculated, evil plan, though it can certainly feel that way from the inside, especially in the middle of a sleepless night spent replaying what was said. Most of the time, it runs on something far simpler and far more mechanical. A person testing the terrain over and over, because nothing has ever told them where the terrain ends. And here is the part that changes everything once you truly absorb it. The testing does not stop because the other person suddenly develops empathy, has a moment of insight, or finally understands how much they've hurt you. It stops when one boundary, held without exception, finally gives them the information that no amount of pushing, pleading, or explaining ever gave them before. This is not a video about identifying toxic people. You already know who they are. You have known for a long time. If you are honest with yourself, even if you have not always let yourself say it plainly, even if you have spent years finding kinder words for what was happening because the truth felt too heavy to hold. This is about the one boundary that actually works, not the 10 rules you have tried and abandoned, not the speech you have rehearsed 100 times in the shower and never delivered, not the ultimatum you have threatened and quietly walked back more times than you'd like to admit, but the single, specific shift in behavior that stops the testing at its root. By the end of this, you will know exactly what it is, why almost nothing else actually works instead of it, how to recognize the different faces the testing wears, and how to begin building this one boundary starting today, in the smallest and most ordinary moment life happens to hand you. Here is the part almost no one explains clearly. Toxic behavior is not random. It follows a pattern so consistent it could almost be called a method, even when the person running it has no idea they are running it at all. And this last part matters more than it seems. Most people picture toxic behavior as deliberate cruelty, plotted in advance by someone who knows exactly what they're doing and enjoys it. Sometimes that is true, but far more often, the pattern is not a plan at all. It is simply a habit, formed early, reinforced constantly, running on autopilot in someone who has never once been given a reason to interrupt it. Understanding this does not excuse the behavior. It simply explains why appealing to someone's better nature so rarely works. You are not negotiating with a decision. You are negotiating with a reflex. The pattern always begins small. Nobody opens a relationship with outright disrespect that would be caught and rejected immediately, and the testing would end before it began. Instead, it opens with something almost forgivable. A comment that stings slightly more than it should, a boundary crossed just barely enough to be deniable, a request made that costs you a little more than it should have, and then everyone watches consciously or not to see what happens next. This opening move is rarely even remembered by the person who made it, because for them it cost nothing. For you, it is often the first thread in a much longer rope, though you have no way of knowing that yet. If nothing happens next, If the moment passes with no cost attached to it, the test has succeeded, and the pattern escalates. This is not a metaphor. It is closer to a mechanical certainty than most people realize. A boundary that is not enforced is not actually a boundary, it is simply a preference, and preferences are, by their very nature, negotiable. Toxic behavior is remarkably good at sensing the difference between the two, often faster than the person being tested is able to sense it themselves, because the toxic pattern has had a great deal of practice reading exactly this signal in exactly this way, sometimes across many relationships, over many years, long before it ever arrived in yours. This explains something that confuses almost everyone who has lived through it. Why the disrespect always seems to get worse over time instead of better, even when you have been patient. Even when you have been endlessly understanding, even when you have given every possible benefit of every possible doubt, even when you have privately told yourself that surely, this time, things will change, because you have been so careful, so accommodating, so willing to meet them halfway. Patience, on its own, without an enforced boundary underneath it, does not read as kindness to a pattern that is testing for weakness. It reads as confirmation. Every quiet accommodation, however well-intentioned, becomes one more piece of evidence that this particular door was never actually locked. And every act of forgiveness offered without a corresponding consequence becomes, in the eyes of the pattern, simply further proof that forgiveness is unconditional and therefore free. There is a belief many people carry, usually without examining it closely, that if they are simply good enough, patient enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough, the toxic behavior will eventually respond to that goodness and soften on its own, the way warmth eventually melts something cold if it's given enough time. This belief is one of the most costly a person can hold, because it is almost never true, and holding on to it usually costs years, sometimes an entire decade or more, spent waiting for a shift that was never actually coming, because nothing about your goodness was ever the variable the pattern was responding to. Goodness, offered without a boundary attached to it, is not received as an invitation to change. It is received as safety, safety to continue exactly as before, because nothing about the behavior has ever actually cost anything. And safety, once established, is rarely given up voluntarily by anyone benefiting from it. This is not a reason to become hardened or suspicious of everyone in your life, and it would be a mistake to walk away from this with your guard raised against people who have never once tested you and never will. Most relationships are not built on this dynamic at all, and most people are not running any test on you whatsoever. They are simply moving through the world in good faith, the same way you are, making ordinary mistakes that are followed by ordinary repair, without any pattern underneath them at all. Discernment matters enormously here. What is being described is a specific repeating pattern, recognizable once you know what to look for. The small transgression, followed by careful observation of your reaction, followed by either retreat or escalation, depending entirely on what that reaction was. Once you can see this pattern clearly, you stop mistaking it for ordinary human imperfection, and you start seeing it for what it actually is. And just as importantly, you stop mistaking ordinary human imperfection for this pattern, which is its own kind of freedom. There are 4 ways this testing typically shows up, and almost everyone who has lived with a toxic person will recognize most, if not all of them, often within the very same relationship, sometimes even within the very same week. The first is the small transgression disguised as harmless, a joke made at your expense in front of others, delivered with just enough charm that objecting to it would make you look humorless. A favor asked of you that quietly costs more than it should, framed in language that makes declining feel selfish. A boundary crossed so gently that naming it out loud feels like an overreaction, even though something in you already knows it wasn't. This is the opening move, and it is almost always small on purpose, because small is deniable, and deniable is safe for the person running the test. It gives them a ready-made exit. I was only joking. You're reading too much into it. I didn't think it would bother you. Each one designed to make the discomfort seem like a flaw in your reaction rather than an accurate response to what actually happened. What most people do here is exactly what the pattern is hoping for. Nothing. They let it pass, tell themselves it wasn't a big deal, decide that raising it would make them seem difficult, petty, or humorless in front of people whose opinion they still at that point care about. And in that moment of letting it pass, without a single word being exchanged about it, information has already been transferred. The test has already returned its result. This is precisely why the behavior returns, usually a little larger the second time, because the first time taught the pattern everything it needed to know, and it did not need you to say a word to learn it. The second way this testing shows up is through your reaction itself becoming the actual target. Once a small transgression has landed, toxic behavior often shifts its focus away from the original offense and toward how you respond to being called out on it, if you dare to call it out at all. This is where guilt gets deployed with real precision, the sudden hurt tone, the accusation that you are being too sensitive, too dramatic, impossible to please, when only a moment ago you were simply asking for something reasonable. This maneuver is not accidental. It is one of the most effective tools available to this pattern, because it successfully redirects the entire conversation away from the original behavior and onto your character instead. And once the conversation is about your character, the original offense is quietly forgotten by everyone except you. This is the moment where so many people quietly abandon their own boundary, not because the boundary was wrong, but because defending it suddenly feels exhausting, unwinnable, not worth the accusation of being difficult, not worth the cold silence that so often follows if you push any further. And once that abandonment happens even once, the pattern learns something extremely valuable. That guilt is a reliable tool for making this particular boundary disappear. It will use that tool again. It will use it more efficiently each time, because efficiency is exactly what patterns are built to develop, and a tool that has worked once is a tool that gets reached for automatically the next time resistance appears. The third way this testing shows up is through triangulation, bringing other people into the dynamic, whether directly or simply by reputation, so that the cost of holding your boundary becomes social as well as personal. This might look like being painted, subtly, as the difficult one in a group, the sensitive one, the one who can't take a joke, long before you have ever raised your voice about anything. It might look like your concerns being repeated back to you, second-hand, through someone else, framed in a way that makes you sound unreasonable. This tactic is particularly effective because it does not require you to be wrong about anything at all. It only requires enough doubt to be planted that defending yourself starts to feel like it will cost you more relationships than the one you're actually trying to protect. The fourth way this testing shows up is through escalation once small boundaries have already failed to hold. This is the stage many people recognize only in hindsight, looking back and wondering how things ever got this far, when the honest answer is that it happened exactly the way it always happens, one untested boundary at a time, each one slightly larger than the last, until the distance between where things started and where things ended up became almost impossible to see from the inside. Escalation rarely announces itself as escalation. It simply feels, at each individual step, like a continuation of everything that came before, because in a very real sense it is. And the person living through it is usually the last one to notice how far the ground has actually shifted beneath them. Here is the boundary that changes all four of these patterns at once, and it is simpler than almost anyone expects, though simple has never meant easy. It is this: consequences that are consistent, calm, and enforced without requiring the other person's agreement first. Not a bigger argument, not a better explanation, not a more emotional appeal to their conscience, not a longer, more carefully worded message sent at midnight in the hope that this time, finally, the words will land the way they were meant to. A consequence small or large depending on the offense that happens the same way, every time, regardless of how the other person reacts to it, regardless of whether they apologize, explain, minimize, or deny. This is the piece almost every other approach misses, because almost every other approach still depends, somewhere underneath it, on the other person's cooperation. A conversation asking them to change depends on their willingness to hear it. A boundary stated out loud, without any consequence attached, depends on their willingness to respect a sentence. Even an ultimatum, delivered with real conviction, depends entirely on your willingness to follow through on it later, when the moment has passed and the anger has cooled, and it would simply be easier to let it slide one more time. But a consequence that happens regardless of their reaction depends on nothing from them at all. It depends only on you, which is precisely why it is the only version of a boundary that a testing pattern cannot talk its way around. Consider what this actually looks like in practice, because it rarely resembles the dramatic confrontation people imagine when they picture setting a boundary. It might look like ending a phone call the moment it turns into a pattern you have already named as unacceptable, calmly, without raising your voice, and simply not picking up again that same day. It might look like declining an invitation the next time, without explanation, after a pattern of disrespect at the last one. It might look like quietly reducing what you share, what you offer, what access someone has to your time, not as a punishment announced with fanfare, but as a simple, consistent recalibration based entirely on what has actually been demonstrated, rather than what you keep hoping might eventually change. It might look, in some of the more serious cases, like no longer being available on short notice for someone who has shown, again and again, that your time is only valuable to them when it's convenient. Notice what none of this requires. It does not require the other person to understand why. It does not require them to agree that the consequence is fair. It does not require a resolution, a reconciliation, or even a conversation at all, though a conversation can certainly accompany it if you choose. The consequence works because it is real, not because it is explained well. This is the single biggest shift most people need to make, because they have spent years believing that if they could only explain their boundary clearly enough, persuasively enough, kindly enough, the other person would finally respect it. But a pattern built on testing was never actually waiting for a better explanation. It was waiting to see whether anything would actually happen. Give it an answer, consistently, and the testing has nowhere left to go. It's worth pausing here to address the fear that quietly sits underneath most of this for almost everyone. The fear that enforcing a real consequence will end the relationship entirely, and that ending it is somehow worse than staying inside a pattern that has been slowly wearing you down for years. Sometimes, it is true, a relationship does not survive a boundary, but what that usually reveals is that the relationship was never actually built on respect to begin with, only on your willingness to go without it. A connection that requires you to remain untested in order to continue was never offering you very much in the first place, however painful that realization can be to sit with. Building this takes practice, because most people have spent far longer practicing the opposite, absorbing, explaining, softening, giving one more chance. And old patterns do not dissolve simply because you have understood them intellectually. There are 4 places to begin. Start with naming the pattern to yourself, privately, with total honesty, before you attempt to change anything externally at all. Write down, if it helps, the specific behavior that keeps repeating, and the specific moment each time where you have chosen to let it pass. This is not about assigning blame to yourself for what happened before. It is about seeing the pattern clearly enough that you can finally recognize it in real time, the next time it begins, instead of only recognizing it afterward, in hindsight, the way you always have before. Next, choose one single consequence in advance, for one single recurring behavior, and decide exactly what it will be before the moment arrives. This matters enormously, because in the heat of the actual moment, clear thinking becomes very difficult, and the old habit of letting things pass will feel, in that instant, like the path of least resistance. Deciding in advance, if this happens again, I will end the call, or if this happens again, I will not attend, removes the need to think clearly under pressure. You are simply executing a decision you already made calmly in a quieter moment with a clear head, long before the provocation had any chance to cloud your judgment. Then, prepare yourself specifically for the guilt that will very likely follow the first time you actually hold this boundary, because it almost always comes, and it is almost never a sign that you did something wrong. Know, in advance, what that guilt is likely to sound like, the hurt tone, the accusation of coldness, the sudden reminder of everything you supposedly owe this person, so that when it arrives, you can recognize it immediately for exactly what it is. Not evidence against your boundary, but evidence that your boundary is finally working. Finally, practice holding the consequence through the discomfort that follows it, because the discomfort is not a sign that you have done something wrong. It is, almost universally, a sign that the pattern is testing whether this particular boundary will hold the same way every previous one did. The guilt, the accusation of being cold or dramatic, the sudden hurt, these often intensify immediately after a consequence is enforced for the first time, not because the boundary was wrong, but because the pattern is running its final, most desperate test. Holding steady through exactly this moment is what separates a boundary that actually works from every boundary that has ever quietly dissolved the moment it was challenged. There is real cost to skipping this, and it rarely announces itself as a single dramatic loss. It shows up instead as years spent absorbing a little more each time, explaining a little more, shrinking a little more, until the version of you that existed before any of this began becomes difficult to even remember clearly. Relationships built on an untested pattern of disrespect do not typically stay the same size. They grow slowly, in the exact direction that nothing was ever stopped from growing. And the person inside them often does not notice how much ground has been lost until they are standing very far from where they started, wondering how they got there, wondering, sometimes, who they even were before any of it began. There was a man who spent nearly a decade in a friendship that, from the outside, looked entirely ordinary. There were good moments in it, genuine laughter, real history, enough warmth scattered throughout to make the harder parts feel like the exception rather than the rule. But underneath the good moments, a pattern had been quietly running for years. Careless comments in front of others, favors that were never returned, plans changed at the last minute with no real apology. And each time he had let it pass, telling himself it wasn't worth the conflict, that this was simply how the friendship was, that raising it would make him seem petty over something so small. The pattern did not stay small. It rarely does. By the 9th year, the carelessness had become so routine that he had stopped even registering it as carelessness. It had simply become the water he was swimming in, invisible, because it had never once been interrupted long enough to be seen clearly. It took a single moment, almost too ordinary to mention, for something in him to finally shift, a canceled plan. The 4th in a row, met with the same breezy apology as always. And for the first time in 9 years, instead of saying it was fine, he simply did not make new plans. No confrontation, no speech. Just the quiet, consistent absence of the availability that had always, until that point, been guaranteed no matter what. The friendship did not end that day, and it did not need to. What changed was smaller and, in its own way, far more significant. For the first time, an action had actually cost something. The next invitation that came was different, more consideration in it, more effort, an unspoken awareness that something had shifted. Nothing was ever explained in detail. It did not need to be. The consequence had said everything the years of careful, patient conversation never had. There was another version of this same lesson, learned much faster, by a woman who had only known her boyfriend for 8 months before the pattern started showing itself clearly. It began with small comments about her appearance, delivered as jokes, followed immediately by, "I'm just teasing you," the moment her face gave anything away. It moved, within a few months, into criticism dressed as concern, comments about her friends, her choices, her time, always framed as though they came from a place of care. She had spent those months explaining, gently pushing back, hoping that clarity alone would be enough to shift something that clarity was never actually built to shift. The boundary, when she finally found it, was almost anticlimactic in how simple it was. The next time a comment landed the way the others had, she did not argue, did not explain, did not ask him to understand. She picked up her things and left, calmly, without raising her voice, and did not answer his calls again that night. The following days brought exactly what the pattern in the first story had brought: accusations of overreacting, a wounded, bewildered tone, a sudden flood of affection meant to smooth everything back over as quickly as possible. She held the boundary anyway, not because it was easy, but because she had decided, in a quieter moment, exactly what she would do if this happened again. And she was simply following through on a decision she had already made. What she learned within a matter of weeks was something the first story took nearly a decade to reveal. A pattern that meets real, consistent consequences either changes quickly or it reveals itself as something that was never going to change at all, and either answer, however it arrives, is worth having far sooner than later. Today, before this day ends, choose one recurring behavior from someone in your life that you have let pass more times than you can comfortably count, and decide clearly and specifically what the next consequence will be if it happens again. Write it down if that helps make it real. You do not need to announce it, explain it, or wait for the perfect moment to deliver it as a speech. You only need to be ready to follow through, calmly, the next time the pattern shows up, asking once again whether anything has actually changed. And when that moment comes, let your answer be an action instead of a sentence. That is the boundary that finally holds, not because of what it says, but because of what it actually does.